Cool, and we are now live. Hello everyone, welcome to day 3 of the Tech Recruitment Takeover. For those that have joined the first couple of days will know we have to do this awkward minute or two of waiting while Zoom lets everybody in. So we'll let the numbers jump up for the first couple of minutes, and then we will jump into today's panel, all around candidate experience and hiring manager experience, and another stellar lineup of guests. So we will make sure everybody is introduced and everybody knows who is who for today's session. Whilst we wait, I'll touch on a few bits of the housekeeping, but we'll do a few slides on it in a second. But we want these sessions to be as interactive as possible. So if you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A section. And we will make sure that the panelists give their thoughts on any questions you guys have got. And we will also, all of this is being recorded, so we'll also create a write-up afterwards and share all of the content afterwards as well. So yeah, we'll give it another minute or so. Let Zoom do its thing. Don't know why I can't just let everyone in at one go and we have to do this nice minute or two awkwardness, but it is what it is. Yeah, and then for tomorrow and Friday session, just in case people aren't aware, tomorrow we are talking through probably an area in the recruitment funnel that gets the least attention, but is crucial, which is onboarding and retention. And there's no point having a great talent acquisition strategy if you can't retain your talent at the other side. So that's going to be a really interesting session. And then we end the week on Friday with a session on diversity and inclusion. So whilst the numbers still go up, we'll get the panelists to do a quick introduction on them before we jump into today's session. So we'll start with Morven. Morven heads up recruitment at LexisNexis Risk Solutions Group. I got it right, it's a new job title. Morven, do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark was it is quite a mouthful. We have, as of 1st November, rebranded our various Read Business Information and LexisNexis brands. So we are now LexisNexis Risk Solution Group, shortly known as RSG. So I head up the talent acquisition team for EMEA and APAC, and that's across the 8 different brands that are part of RSG, and it's across all functions. But today, of course, we'll be focusing on technology. Fantastic. So I've got recruiters in London and in Paris and in Singapore.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Morven. Ed. So Ed, I think Ed's official title is Principal Technology Recruiter at Skyscanner. But Ed, do you want to give a quick introduction on yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. My official title, I think, is Senior Talent Acquisition Manager, but I am, in effect, an individual contributor. So I don't run a team, but I sit in a position where I get to sort of overlook how we go to market, how we engage with candidates, try and be some kind of SME over the best practice of recruitment. My background is very much tech focused, so that's where I hang around. I'm still hands-on as a recruiter, and yeah, slightly obsessed with candidate experience. So hopefully I'm on the right panel here.
I hope so. And last but not least, we have Jatinder Bansal, who heads up tech recruitment at Funding Circle. Jack, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, hi Mark. Like Mark said, I head up the tech and also risk hiring for Funding Circle, and got a global team of sources and sort of TA partners across the US, UK, and also Europe. So great to be here.
Fantastic, and thank you all so much for joining. I'm really excited because we've got lots of different types of companies on the panel today, so we should get some very different perspectives. Just some quick housekeeping for those that joined slightly late. We want these sessions to be as interactive as possible, so please submit any Q&As. There's a Q&A button at the bottom for you to submit. We are doing the Hack a Job Wine Club. It is back. So if you attend 4 of the 5 sessions this week, you will be invited to the Hack a Job Wine Club. We are trying to break the record for the largest ever virtual wine tasting. Let's see if we can or not. And obviously our panelists will be invited should they wish. So feel free to get involved with that. And moving on to today's session. So the agenda for today and what we're really going to be focusing on is candidate experience, but also hiring manager experience, which again is potentially an area of the the process that doesn't get the attention it necessarily deserves. And a couple of the topics we're going to be discussing is candidate experience in the light of COVID-19. There's been an influx of candidates on the market. Potentially some of the harder to fill roles have maybe been made slightly easier this year. So how do we balance that with candidate experience, but also the challenge of running the process fully remotely and what technology we potentially use to help with that. We're then going to move on to possibly the most heated topic when it comes to candidate experience and tech, and that is the topic of technical testing. Should we do it? How should we do it? What's best practice? So it'll be really interesting to get the panelists' thoughts on that. We're then going to flip over to the hiring manager side, and I think that part of the discussion is really going to focus on how do we get the technical community internally to see recruitment as a strategic function, not as a back office function that they just want to receive CVs from, which I think is one of the biggest challenges that recruiters we work with face. So really interesting to get the panelists' thoughts on that. And then last but not least, we're going to talk around measurement, and is it possible to actually put a quantifiable metric on candidate experience and hiring manager experience? Should we focus more on qualitative feedback? So a lot to get through, and we'll see where we get to. But starting on this topic of candidate experience in the light of COVID-19, Jatinder, we'll come to you first on this one. What's it been like at Funding Circle this year? You guys obviously recruit a lot of technology roles. Naturally, unfortunately, because of COVID-19, there are more candidates on the market. But I think Nick Thompson from IBM on Monday said a really interesting point, which was when Netflix get more subscribers, they don't get lazy on content. They actually double down on content. And now's a really important moment for businesses to focus on candidate experience, but it's very easy to get complacent. How have you thought about this and your team at Funding Circle over the last 6-7 months?
Yeah, it's definitely been a change, right? I think for the industry and for everyone. I think like everyone else, we've had easily around, I would argue, double or triple the amount of applications per role. And I think the key thing here for us has been to make sure that we stick to our sort of standards, right? And we have a ton of candidates. It doesn't mean that you drop the ball on half of them because they might not be good enough, or you might not have the manpower in the team. So we've really sort of redefined, if you like, our standards and principles before we sort of went into all of this whirlwind of candidates that have knocked on our door. And then to keep it sort of really, really smooth for candidates, we've done a bit of a revamp on the touch points and the visuals and some of the more sort of automated processes that go with it all, to make sure that people still get the look and feel of Funding Circle. They can't come into the office anymore and see the cool office, right? But I guess what they can do is hear stories that we can tell them of how our leadership team have treated us, how we've treated our customers. These are really, really important things at the moment as people search for the next role. They want to go to places that treat people really good during these tough times. And so we've sort of almost lent more on talking and spending time with candidates and sort of articulating those areas, as opposed to just showing them all the cool stuff, which I admit is cool as well, but it's probably not as important at the moment to highlight. So we've really thought about our philosophy of what is the EVP of us at the moment during this time, and we've just tried our best to tell that story.
Yeah, fantastic. And more than, LexisNexis Risk Solutions being part of Radix Group, a FTSE 100 company, a massive organization. What were some of the challenges you had around pivoting to remote interviewing, remote onboarding, and how did you kind of manage that at a different scale compared to Funding Circle and Skyscanner?
Yeah, so we've been fortunate. We are a very large organization, but we have still been very cautious in our continuing of hiring. We're probably operating about 60% of our normal levels. And I think one of the big challenges for us, for a long time, we've been banging on this drum about remote working, particularly for technology. And we're saying to the senior leadership team, you're losing out on some great talent because we won't go remote. And we were getting the standard excuse, agile scrums, got to interact with product, we're not set up technology. And then when it's forced upon us, lo and behold, it went very smoothly and everybody's remote, as you know, apart from a few key support people. And then our next challenge was actually getting hiring managers quite happy to engage in the early stages of the interview process virtual, but then in the early days they're like, well, I don't want to make an offer until I can look this candidate in the eye. And it's like, that's not going to happen. And they're like, well, we'll go and hold for 6 weeks. And I think we overcome that basically to an element slightly by intimidation. It's sort of like, okay, every day this organization is reviewing budgets, and if you want to wait 6 weeks, good luck, you might not have this role. So that was a culture change for us very much as well, getting them to engage with that. And then I think to sort of move on from some Jatinder's part, one of our keys is really, how do you sell the culture when they're not in amongst the business or having the opportunity to come in and meet different functions that they might be interacting with? And for us, we've had a very large, significant branding exercise from about 6 months ago, which is all about the different brands and explore more, and our EVP and the technology, all the recruiters, but technology included, were challenged heavily to become ambassadors of the EVP and engage with LinkedIn. And if any of you look up any of my recruiters, you'll see every day everybody's posting something about LinkedIn. And yes, it's about the jobs, but a lot of the time it's about that culture. It's about the fact that we have care days where you have paid days off, the fact that we have diversity and inclusion days. Again, you have paid days off to do these things. Messages from our senior leaders about our work environment and how we must take care of ourselves, and we always have a choice. So we're really trying to build that culture. So those are kind of the key things for us.
Amazing. And I guess, Ed, getting your take on this, very different. Skyscanner obviously was at the front line of being impacted by COVID. So what's it been like for you guys over the last 7-8 months?
Yeah, we are, obviously in the travel industry, there are not that many flights to search on at the moment, but it's been an interesting ride for us. I think with the move to doing everything remotely, it was actually pretty easy for us in many ways. We, this time last year, we were a company of about 1,500 people distributed over 11 offices. So every meeting at Skyscanner has a Zoom link automatically. We were able to do full interview processes remotely when we needed. And so we were kind of pretty well set up for moving that completely remote as standard. Interviewers were pretty comfortable with making decisions. And we already had systems in place to make sure candidates felt like they knew the company and were able to make a decision whether to work with us or not without seeing an office, which I think is something a lot of companies are finding out now. For me, and I've spoken to other recruiters in other companies around this, the office is just one part of why somebody would choose to work for you. And what's being challenged now for recruiters is, how do we provide that information to candidates? The information about what tech they'll work on, what problems they'll solve, who they'll work with day to day. That's just a case of how you now get that information across to them without dragging them into the office. And I think that's a really positive thing that could come out of this year in terms of challenging recruiters to be better at getting information to the candidates.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, when you go for a crisis like COVID, naturally you are going to be challenged as a team and you are going to have to think on your feet. And I think we saw it very early. The businesses that were able to respond quickly actually had probably a 6 to 8 week period where they could kind of hire a lot more talent than what they would normally, because everybody was figuring out what do they do. But what have you done at Skyscanner? And I know you've not necessarily been hiring, throughout this period of time, but what are some of the ways you guys are thinking about positioning the tech stack, and positioning the teams that they might be working with? I know you've got quite an interesting interview process where they don't necessarily interview for a team, up front. What are some of the things that you and your team are looking at to try and convey that message beyond the office?
Yeah, our offices are amazing, but actually, I don't think anybody ever joined us because of the office. Our engineering culture is probably the strongest thing. We have really clearly defined principles of how we develop software at Skyscanner. Everybody understands how they fit into quite a customized, unique squads and tribes model. And people are genuinely interested in the learning curve that they can have once they join our setup. So I think pushing that information, which we have always done, but actually about a year ago we started a new program of work to redevelop our employer brand based on a rebranding of the company as well, and how we push that through different methods. I think there's lots of things that have happened, but sometimes the best things are the really simple ones. So for instance, we've developed a single page website which is exclusive for candidates in process. So you can't search through it. It's not indexed on Google, but on every template, automated email and interview confirmation that goes out from Skyscanner, there's a link to it to remind them to refer to it. It goes through the interview process. They know what it is up front. It preps them on how to think about the kind of answers they might want to prepare for things. It gives them indicators to what our culture is and why we're interviewing in certain ways. And our interview process is tough and it's extensive. But what we want to do is get a candidate into that position where they feel comfortable about why they're being asked that question and what we're looking for from the answer to set them up well. So I think little things like that, just constantly getting little bits of information across them in different ways is really important right now.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting phrase, right? The goal of candidate experience is almost to make the candidate feel comfortable so they can do the best job possible and put themselves in the best light, right? That's an interesting definition almost, or an interesting goal of candidate experience is actually, well, we just want to create the best experience. When you get on the Zoom interview, you excel. And it's really interesting that you can do a simple one-page website that helps that. And then you could probably over-engineer it and think of some crazy tools to help that. Jack, what have you guys done at Funding Circle? Have you looked at any cool tools to kind of facilitate the candidate experience? Or are you just stripping it back and just training your humans to make sure that the recruitment team are there to give that candidate experience?
Yeah, so I would say, we actually went through a bit of before the world of coronavirus even existed for us, we went through a bit of an overhaul on our process anyway to strip it down quite a bit. There was a goal there of time to hire and reducing that, and so we'd stripped down the process. So it was only like two stages really per candidate, and when we go through this sort of remote style of interviewing, it actually makes it really easy, right, to actually just shift it all online. I think that there has been an element of firming up what is a consistent view of candidates and Zoom interviews and Zoom etiquettes and stuff like that, right? I think like we've all had to go through that, and people on both sides of the hiring process have had to get very comfortable with doing Zoom interviews, right? And some candidates naturally will be quite shy on interviews, and some people will be like, just could be staring at the wall for an interview, right? You should expect a lot of things. And I think we've done a lot of sort of human training, if you like, as opposed to getting some new tools in. But actually, we found it to be, if your sort of process is already set up where it's quite minimal, but quite high impact, whether you hire remotely or not, I think it still is just as good. We went through a bit of a defining moment internally because we've never had to do it before, of defining remote working versus flexible working and just educating the world on what we mean by that, and so we went through a bit of a defining moment for us around that. And to my surprise, remote working hasn't really sort of been an issue for candidates. It seems candidates seem to be asking us around flexible working as opposed to remote working. But yeah, I would say more human training and more just conversations as opposed to tooling.
And the final point you touched on there, this definition of remote work versus flexible work, is really interesting. And I think we've seen it this year, this evolution of remote work, right? Probably in January, we all thought remote work was sitting on a beach in Bali with a laptop and a pina colada, right? And that was kind of the stereotype. But we've had a question in from Claire, which kind of touches on this exact point. And Claire kind of mentions that actually a lot of the candidates they've hired through this period want that hybrid model where they're maybe in the office a few days a week, but also maybe at home a few days a week. And maybe this truly, being fully remote isn't what people want. Morven, what's kind of your take on this? How are you collecting some of that data around what people want?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So as an organization, we've had internally within the organization two different surveys now, one early on in the pandemic and one later in the pandemic. And that was from the approach of, as a hiring manager, as a line manager, what are you prepared to accept in terms of working conditions from your team? And then as an employee, what are you looking for? But we've now taken it to another level where we're actually engaging our candidates that we have spoken to, that we've engaged with, that we're starting to interact with, sending them a survey. And of course, as recruiters, we have no sight of these results. This is a project that's administered by a team in the US, and is asking just that question. If you joined our company, what do you want to do? Do you want to be 100% remote? Are you comfortable with that? Do you prefer an office environment? Do you want flexi time? And flexi time is something, again, gets to Jatinder's point about flexible and remote. That was something that was very much endorsed within the initial lockdown by our organization, as people have got young children, they can't log on regularly. So we very much adopted flexi time, and it was sort of do what you can when you can as an approach as a company. So we were a very empathetic company, but it's collating that data from our next generation of employees. And I think that's great. I think we will ultimately be a hybrid model also.
Yeah, interesting. And Ed, we'll finish with you on this topic before we move on to the next topic for today. But where's Skyscanner's stance on this at the moment? And from speaking to candidates and your team speaking to candidates, what's your kind of feel? Do you think that fully remote model is the right model? Do you think this hybrid approach is the right approach?
Personally, I hope Skyscanner never get rid of their offices, because working from home is great for a couple of days, but for me, I love that flavour of being in the office and being around my team and things. And long term, I can't wait to get back to it. Skyscanner has always been pretty flexible. We had a system before COVID of sort of try and be in the office more than you're not. So people generally did 3 days in and 2 days out. I live out near Bath, and so I took full advantage of my team's flexibility around it. I was speaking to a colleague yesterday, and you know, one of you're always going to get some people who are really extreme about remote working and want to do it for the rest of their lives. Other people who feel like they really need to be in an office every day. I think that happy medium is where most people are going to end up landing. And we were talking about this growth of the remote only company. You know, so many companies are moving in that direction, or startups are being formed around that philosophy. And I can see a good central London office or good central city office being almost a company benefit in the future. You know, people choosing a company because it offers them the opportunity to go in 1 day a week or 3 days a week to hang out with their team and to have lunch somewhere different and to get out of their kitchens. And you know, particularly in London, where a spare room to have a home office is at such a premium, that it's not necessarily everybody's hope that they have to work in their bedroom for the rest of their lives, right?
I think so. And I think that's definitely the trend we've seen, right? I think of how companies have reacted most commonly, I think this year has been this concept of like remote UK, which is, we'll kind of hire you anywhere in the UK on the expectation that you'll need to spend some time in the office and some time from home. Yeah. And I think that's great because it opens up the candidate funnel, right? You can suddenly look further afield, which also has really positive diversity and inclusion impact as well. But it gives candidates that balance between the two. And it's interesting, maybe that will be the perk, you know, top line, we have an office that you
have a desk somewhere, that's it.
Love it. No, really interesting. So switching gears slightly, moving on, technical testing. It is the most interesting debate when we talk about candidate experience and how we balance, you know, saving our hiring managers time and making sure they're only speaking to relevant engineers that have got the skills versus delivering this great candidate experience and making sure that you're not sending out a technical test that takes 10 hours to complete and nobody's doing it, and you know, you're left with a talent pool that isn't going to suffice. Ed, I know you spent a lot of time at Skyscanner thinking about technical testing. Give us your 2 cents. Where are you at now on the topic of technical testing? What do you think the right approach is to get that balance between candidate experience but also a filtering process?
So I think technical testing, but interviews as a whole, I mean, everybody's kind of conscious that interviews aren't a brilliant process to work out if you should be spending 8 hours a day with this person in front of you. You know, ideally you do it for 6 months before you make that decision, but it's kind of a necessary evil. And I think the end goal is to make that as enjoyable and as relevant and as accurate as possible. Technical testing, I think for a lot of roles in the tech world is important. I think, you know, there's no getting around that actually they do give you good evidence around how somebody performs in certain situations. So if you're going to do it, I think there's a few things that you should try and make sure you're doing for the candidate's sake, but also for your own. One of the things that really frustrates me is the you know, I won't name a platform that does it a lot, but there's platforms out there that just throw really super generic, you know, solve this Sudoku challenge kind of test out there to software engineers who will never do that as a thing in the job. So to make one of the things we've done at Skyscanner over the last couple of years is try and make every test that we send out to candidates really relevant to us. So a lot of the tests involve things like building a very mini Skyscanner. Like, here's a flight path. How would you create a search function around that? Or how would you guide travelers through this system of trying to search for where to go? The other thing is to make it really engaging, so to give them an opportunity to hear feedback on that, maybe use it later in the process as another part of an interview. Ideally, the best results we've had is to move away from that automated test style and to do code pairing sessions with engineers, and that has been our best result by a long way. So we ran a 6-month pilot test, and we ended up with data that showed us that candidates stuck in the process twice as much as they did once they'd done that test. We were twice as accurate at gauging whether they were technically the right fit for us, and the feedback we were getting was unbelievable, just because they had an opportunity really early on in the process to play around with genuine Skyscanner problems with a Skyscanner engineer who would get excited about different ideas and different solutions, and give them an opportunity to ask any questions they wanted about life at Skyscanner. And some asked about how testing was done, and some asked about general culture or CEO or something like that. So that for us has been the best way to engage people, not only get them through that stage, but actually to motivate them to carry on and to come and work with us.
Yeah, I love it. And I won't bias any other panelists. I'll give my views at the end. Morven, where are you at in technical testing? I know this is something that some of your hiring team are looking at, actively at the moment. What's kind of the stance?
We're massively not consistent as an organization across our different brands. And I think it really is dependent on the hiring manager. Some are looking to standardize it and bring in a sort of external testing function. For most, I think what we do is part of the interview process, there's some really in-depth into technical interviewing with engineers that would be their peers. In non-COVID times, they would be in the office and they might even be given a whiteboard and doing some coding. So it tends to be more traditional, in-depth with somebody would be their peer. But it's interesting because my own views on testing, I think for technology, absolutely it has a very relevant part to play. But one thing that we are consistent in, is when we're testing for our graduate programs, for the technologies for the graduate programs, and we grade them gold, silver or bronze. And interesting, on our last intake for 2019-20, this year's group, that they then come to an assessment day, the 2 top candidates were bronze in their testing results, but absolutely they were the 2 first hires that we made. So I think that, is it the defining factor of the interview process, or is it a good indicator? Just throw that out there.
Yeah, love it. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I don't see enough businesses do, right, is trying to, and I think, Ed, this is kind of your point around the interview process, full stop, is how do you correlate good performance at interview with good performance in your job? Because that's all we're trying to do, right, is a prediction of how likely this person is to go on and perform well in a team environment and technically in their job. And I think that's lost a lot of the time, actually. And actually, just because you scored 98% on an arbitrary computer science problem doesn't necessarily mean you're the right engineer for this job. Jack, where are Funding Circle at from a technical testing perspective?
So, just to mix it up a bit, there's probably a couple of views just to layer onto this. I mean, I think that firstly, like the sort of days of send someone a take-home test, come back to us in like a month or 2 later after spending like 5 weekends on it to get a score that no one's really looked at. I think those days, if anyone is still doing that, I mean, my God, that's so like uncompetitive and like honestly probably really boring for everyone. So just in case like you want to know my view, that's my view. But there's probably a couple of things, like especially at Funding Circle, we've taken a lot of time to do when it comes to like the whole testing idea. I mean, look, when you have people doing testing, especially engineering roles, I think like to the point Morven just said about the weighting of that, right? And I think like it's an indicator for the hiring manager to make a very sort of clear principle on what is the test for, and I think it's really key that we are all aware, and especially the hiring managers aware, is that they set the guidance. They don't take the guidance from people who are reviewing these tests. They should be setting the guidance. So we need to make sure our hiring managers themselves are very accountable and very aware of the hiring process end to end and really, really intricate about it. Otherwise, it will just be left to a recruiter and a developer maybe who's pairing on it, right? And we might all overweight it because that's the thing we're focusing on at that time. And I think the second thing is, I love to make like hiring processes as like engaging as possible. You know, and so one thing we focused on is we don't do any sort of take-home tests, but we implemented something called CoderPad. Some of you might know it, and all it is very basic, but it actually allows us to shred down some of the steps. And we actually have a video call, just like we're on now, whilst we're pairing a solution. So actually the hiring manager call, which a lot of people do, and the tech test is on one call, right? You actually get to talk through someone, how they're doing, all the good stuff that you normally do in a normal pairing session in person. Versus just seeing a result and thinking it's a pass or fail. You can really make a better and deep sort of engagement with that person. And you know what? The candidate loves that a lot better than sort of doing some homework for a company that's not paying them yet, right? So it's a lot more engaging. So that's what we're doing at Funding Circle. And we have found, you know, we did a similar thing like Skyscanner and Ed did, A/B tested it, and we found that the end-to-end time was dramatically increased, and the pass rate was much higher. And actually, I think everyone generally enjoyed the process more as well, as what we saw in feedback. So that's how we sort of view it.
Yeah, and I think I'm in complete agreement, right? These live code interviews just seem to have so many more benefits. In fact, Daisy, who is on the call but muted with her camera off, we were literally discussing this morning around all of the benefits to a live pair programming interview, which you've all touched on, versus the automated assessment, which kind of been popular over the last decade or so. But I think one of the big pushbacks our clients get when they're trying to pivot is that the live pairing takes a lot more time for hiring managers. It's a lot easier just to send out 100 technical tests and, you know, wait to see what comes back. And then the other angle normally is a hiring manager will say, well, I completed the test and I was good enough to pass. So, you know, if I'm good enough, then I want my team to be good enough. Ed, how have you thought about challenging the hiring managers, educating the hiring managers at Skyscanner to try and move them away from the automated assessment that they would have done to get their job at Skyscanner?
Well, actually, when I joined, one of the first challenges I was given was to sort of create this culture of change with technical testing. And I sat in front of this panel of quite senior people and was told, look, there's going to be a lot of resistance. You need to go in hard. So 20 minutes of a rant later, they all turned around and said, yeah, we all want to change it. We know it's terrible. And, you know, so I was like, oh, okay, this might be easier after all. But one thing we talked a lot about actually is Skyscanner is such a customer obsessed company. I mean, it's like traveler first as a phrase is talked about endlessly. And I think this is something that should be done all the time from a TA perspective, is change the word candidate to customer and then decide if you're treating people in the right way. Would you treat your customers, people who will actually pay money for your product, in the same way you treat your candidates? And if that's not the case, if you're not optimizing that experience for your candidates in the same way as your customers, then you need to change it. So what we started doing was saying, okay, look, talent acquisition directly touch, I think at the time it was like 80,000, 90,000 candidates a year. You know, we have email, phone, Zoom, face-to-face contact with that many people. If there was a team in Skyscanner that had that much contact with customers, we would be really worried about, are we looking after them in the right way and doing all these things? And rather than sending them an automated test, which had no relevancy to Skyscanner, gave us kind of a mixed reading of whether they could do the job anyway, and generally put them off the brand. I mean, nobody appreciated getting that test. So once we talked with senior people around that type of thing and making the recruitment process traveler first, it became quite easy to get them on board and for them to be quite open-minded about how we change that. So that's when we started making everything around, let's give them a little taste of what Skyscanner is about and give them exposure to how complex our problems are and how, you know, technology at scale works at Skyscanner. And it adds to something I've talked to you over a burger with Mark, but we've talked about if you can go one step further and give candidates an opportunity to learn something as well, then their time suddenly the value of it is increased dramatically. So for instance, Skyscanner have quite a well-known design system. People in the front end world love it. They get to know it's open source. You can go on and play with it. But we introduce that in a lot of our tests. So we say, here's our design system. We've set it up nice and easy for you to use, but it gives them an opportunity to learn how we use that in day-to-day world, and the feedback on that is brilliant. You know, people genuinely say, oh, I'm going to go off and use it, or I'm going to tweak the design system I use to be a bit more like that. And I think when you give them an opportunity to learn something and improve themselves because they've done the interview, that's where you're starting to add value to their time, and I think that's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the best assessments we see is when people open up APIs that maybe aren't always publicly available and things like that. We've had unsurprisingly a few questions come in because it's obviously the heated topic. Claire's asked a really interesting question, and Claire, we'll make sure we ask this to the panel on Friday as well, because we're doing a whole session on diversity and inclusion on Friday. But I will open it up to the panelists today just to see if anyone has thought about this and if there's any ideas around it. But Claire's basically asked, you know, has anyone amended their technical assessments if a candidate has dyslexia or, you know, another form of neurodiversity? And if so, how have they gone, you know, about amending that process? And like I said, we'll definitely chuck it out to the panel on Friday, because I think it's a brilliant question. But has anyone on the panel today had any experience on kind of modifying their assessments based on, you know, candidates with dyslexia or any other form of neurodiversity?
I guess I'll just say, Mark, I mean, I haven't had, so I haven't had too many sort of scenarios where we've had to make changes, I guess. I mean, one thing we have, and actually not just at Funding Circle, but I think at most places I've worked out, we take a lot of effort to make sure that the design of the process and the design of the selection process as well is as sort of inclusive as possible. And, you know, I think sometimes it's easier to make some of these changes physically when we're all physically in the office, you know. And I remember once we interviewed and actually hired a software engineer who was wheelchair bound, and he couldn't actually walk, and so we made a few changes for him. And I think, like, remotely, these things are, I would say, harder to find out from people if they do have some support that they need. So the question I think on this chat was dyslexia, for example. I know, I think it was another company, I think it was actually Goldman Sachs, who did a whole blog around autism and engineering, and actually how they've sort of lent in, and they use that to an advantage to find really good engineers. So there is a topic to be had about all this. But I think the key that I've sort of taken from this is that it's something we have to consciously make sure that we are aware of when we move candidates through the process. It won't be so easily identifiable, right? But I haven't had any experiences where we had to change any of our process.
Yeah, for us, we've definitely had the conversation about whether our testing process is inclusive enough, and there's so many aspects of that to think about. When we looked into it, there wasn't an obvious answer in terms of how to make sure you're avoiding any kind of bias or discrimination in that sense. So one of our goals, and we're on the journey, we're certainly not completed the journey, but would be to offer candidates a choice of how they are tested so that they can do it in the most comfortable way possible. So the three options that I would like to see us establish is the code pairing style, where you're face-to-face with an engineer and you can talk through your problems. Maybe then the other option would be to do a take-home test where you can do it in your own time, and it's maybe if you need that extra flexibility, or to do something that you can come back to over a few days or something. And the third option I'd like to introduce at Skyscanner, but we haven't really got this far, is to introduce a more casual conversation where you can talk through previous projects. Ideally, you can go through your GitHub and show open source contributions that you've done, why you chose to do that, how you achieved whatever you did in terms of commits and things. And so to offer three different testing styles where we can ensure that the bar remains the same across all three different aspects, but gives the candidate the choice of choosing what's most comfortable for them and what works best for their needs.
Yeah, awesome. No, really great. And I think the more flexibility you can give candidates in the process, the more inclusive that process is going to be. Morven, what about your team? How are you thinking about inclusivity in the end-to-end recruitment process?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, Claire, I think that's an absolutely brilliant question. And it is something that we're always very acutely aware of. It is still a journey for us in terms of how we approach this. But I know, for instance, not necessarily dyslexia, but we've had a deaf candidate who, you know, because we do telephone screening, whatever, and we've had them have a supporter with them. So we're doing video calls and somebody's supporting them. And I think one thing to remember in any of the candidate experience, if we're engaging with a candidate, it's because we've identified something of value in that candidate, whether it's their previous experience or whatever. And I think maybe Ed touched on it. We really need to give these candidates an opportunity in their own words and in their own way to give their own examples of where they add value and how they feel they can, how they can step up to the role. And I think it's really, with anything around diversity and inclusion, it's really giving a person to the opportunity to prove themselves in their own way and how they're comfortable doing it. And again, it's all down to communicating with the hiring managers. That's absolutely key, that they're understanding, what the diversity for that candidate might be. But it's still early days for us too, I have to say.
Yeah, interestingly, Claire's just commented to say that what they're doing is giving candidates an extra 25% time on that challenge if somebody does have dyslexia. I think on Friday's session, one of the panelists is Paul Humphreys from JP Morgan, who I know has done a lot of work around neurodiversity and designing more bespoke interview processes for that. So Claire, we'll make sure we absolutely ask Paul about that on Friday as well. A couple of other questions. We're going to stick on the topic of technical testing because people are loving it. We will get to hiring managers. I promise. Any hiring managers listening, you are important. We will get to you. But GitHub's come up, and Ed, you just touched it there. We've had a couple of different questions come in, and I guess kind of slightly different questions. But Jack, we can start with you on this one. Are you using GitHub repositories as a supporting document at the sort of hiring manager review stage when hiring managers are deciding to take into process? And are hiring managers open to just considering GitHub repositories full stop instead of technical tests altogether and just actually dive into some code that they've already written?
Yeah, so I mean, I encourage my team definitely to share those repositories with the hiring managers when sort of giving a whole view of a candidate. So the more information we can share, generally the better, is my view. I definitely think that, and I don't know if this is just a funding cycle thing, but I definitely think that not many people would be open to just receiving that, because you don't then have a consistency, you don't have a whole view, right? You might be missing out huge chunks of information on someone if that's the main thing you're sort of centering your review on. But yeah, it's something that I encourage to share. I think it's there for a reason, and it's just information that we can use. So we do share it with hiring teams across Funding Circle.
And Morven, obviously, the business you're in is a much larger organization. Open source development and putting things publicly available is probably a cultural change and a cultural challenge. Where do your recruiters stand on using more open source contributions, whether it be GitHub, Bitbucket, somewhere else, alongside a traditional CV? Is that something your hiring managers are calling for, want more of, or are they very set on the traditional CV document is the right document for them?
We're probably still quite traditional, but I certainly agree with Jatinder that getting consistency in process and fairness, and that each candidate is being assessed in the same way. And I think maybe somebody earlier that was talking about conscious or unconscious bias, and I think that's really important that we have that consistency. I think they're open as much as the hiring managers are allowing them to be. But we do, our HCC platform is of course open source, so we're not entirely without open source, but yeah, some work to be done.
Yeah, awesome. And Ed, we'll wrap up on technical testing with you, and then we'll move on to the hiring manager side. Obviously, Sky's kind of do have a lot of open source stuff. Where kind of do you and your team stand on GitHub contributions at the sourcing stage or as a replacement for assessments?
Yeah, so I think we're a little bit different in the sense that we don't generally do any kind of hiring manager reviews of candidates. So it's only the recruiter that sees a profile before that candidate enters the process. And to avoid bias, we tend not to provide too much information up front, any extra context and things. What we want is for the interviewer to go into each interview and just get the evidence that they're there to collect about whether this candidate has ticked the right boxes in that section. So there's no review of GitHub or anything like that from our side, but this is why I want to introduce it into as a option in the technical testing stage, because I think if you've got a senior engineer who's spent the last 10 years contributing to open source projects, and might spend an average of 5-10 hours a week doing that. What's the point of giving them a 3-hour test, which they've already got so much to show off and to talk through enthusiastically, and that's really relevant to them and is a sign of what they can produce when they're really interested in something. So I think if you could get a good engineer on a call to them and to talk for an hour about why they've done that, and to literally go through a couple of projects and look at the code and understand what's good and what's bad about that, to make a call on whether this person could contribute to our code base. I think that would be a really fun, nice way for the candidate to enter that process.
Yeah, awesome. We could do a whole webinar just on technical testing, but we're going to move on. Some interesting thoughts there, and I think it sounds like, in summary, that more interactive style of testing is probably the best approach, and taking hiring managers on that journey with you is the right approach, and something that we definitely evolved our philosophy on and have built tools around now is more on that live interviewing. But we are gonna finish today's panel on this topic around hiring manager engagement. And I know, Morven, you've done a lot of work with your team on this. How do we make the technical leadership team and the hiring managers see internal recruitment as that strategic function, as a function that actually can give them an edge, rather than just somebody that's going to send them CVs and hope that some of those CVs are relevant?
We have done a huge amount of work on this, Mark, and it's not just in the technology, it's across the entire recruitment function, as we were really driving for the business to accept us as partners, as actually partners to the business. And I think historically there was very, very heavy agency use in part of our businesses. And I think that one of the reasons there was this dependency, if you like, on hiring managers for agency use is the agencies made them feel good because they felt loved. They put out an advert, they got inundated with CVs, and it wasn't a case of analyzing, is this quality CVs or is it volume, but I'm busy because I'm doing interviews. So it was a real education piece around understanding that there is a process from internal recruitment getting to that point of perhaps maybe a week, 2 weeks in before they actually get CVs, and understanding that there's so much interaction with candidates, the volumes of people that we're screening and dealing with. So when they get to that 2-week point and they're getting the CVs, they're getting really well qualified, screened candidates, so that it's saving them time. And it's very much about communications. And I think that one of the things that we've really driven hard is the importance of communications with hiring managers at every step and regularly, so they understand the process and the frustrations, and if there's any fine tuning that needs to be done. We also do hold the hiring managers accountable as well. They have their KPIs in terms of once you open a rec, how you're engaging and the times that you're turning around. And then interestingly, and the hiring managers in the call will love this, we do have a net promoter score for hiring managers. So as soon as we filled a rec for a hiring manager, they're sent a survey as to how recruitment did and what they thought of us and where there was elements for improvements and the quality of the candidates. So they have ownership. It's a partnership now, and it's taken a while to get to there, but absolutely it's been worthwhile.
I love that NPS touch. That's a really, really nice idea. I've not seen many organizations do that. But again,
we're held very accountable.
but a way to build credibility as well, right? Because a high NPS with one hiring manager, you can then take to another hiring manager and say, well, actually, on this team, we're doing a great job. We could be doing a better job with you, but we need that both ways, that buy-in from you as well.
The key to any of this is delivery. You can promise and promise, you have to deliver.
Yeah, I know that as a person who runs a business. Jatinda, something that I've always been very impressed with you, in the various roles you've had at Capital One, Competitor Market, now at Funding Circle, is getting that senior technical leadership brought into recruitment. I know we did a podcast earlier on in the year about this. Talk us through kind of your approach. How do you go about this when you join a new organization to really change their perspective of recruitment internally?
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, look, tech hiring now is definitely got strategic sort of weighting at the table, right? I mean, it's the make or break essentially of a product roadmap, yeah. And it's usually when it goes wrong the most costly function of a workforce. So it is definitely something that if you're going into a tech recruitment role, especially a more senior role, you immediately establish yourself as an expert or an advisor and show actually that you're bringing a fresh perspective with a whole bunch of knowledge, right? That you bring. I think like a lot of people who have been in recruiting, especially, for some of us, for our sins, maybe over like 10 years or 20 years or whatever. And I think what you find is you've got so much knowledge already that you can just tap that into maybe a CTO or C-suite team. And I think the key is really just marrying that up with the commercial goals and the sort of product roadmap that they have, and then sort of setting the standard. So every role I go into, I always immediately set a standard. What is the TA standard with tech? And that's got to be done with the C-suite or the CTO, and then trickle downwards. So, you position yourself as a bit of an advisor, right, to a leadership team. And then when you're speaking to hiring managers, you've already defined the standards with the leadership teams. And this is how we run, this is how we're going to grow, this is how we're going to scale. This is what my team does, this is what your team needs to do. How do we feel about it? There'll be some tweaks here and there. I'm sure there's always a few battles. But ultimately, you are essentially helping them deliver their roadmap. And I think, that needs to be said in the room. It can't just be, here's a role, let's fill a role. When normally you're scaling out so much, it's got to be done in partnership, but also you need to have that very, very clear and common understanding. This is what you are all building together. The recruitment team are not just filling a role and a hiring manager is just literally going to manage that one person. There's a whole sort of ecosystem around what you're doing to deliver the company, the commercial goal. And I think you just work backwards from that. And the minute you start framing it and talking like that to hiring teams, I think they take it all very seriously. Because then they very clearly understand where your role and their role needs to fit together. Otherwise, the sort of leadership team won't be happy with someone, right? And I think it's also, I think for people who are probably more junior or less experienced on this call, of course, I'm not saying on day one, knock on your CTO's door and say, hey, I want to fill all of your roles tomorrow. Who do I speak to? But what I am saying is, find the person in your team. Maybe it is your head of tech recruiting or head of TA or director of HR, whoever. Find who you need to in order to tap into that information so that you are talking strategic goals, commercial goals with your hiring teams. Otherwise, you'll always get a lot of pushback, and I think pace drops a lot and there's not so much common understanding. So that's my honest advice. And I think after that, make sure you deliver, like Morgan said, run a high performing recruitment team. Don't let it sort of fall by the waist, and do what you say you're going to do. I think that's the best way to run with it.
Awesome. And Ed, what's it been like at Skyscanner? You've been there a couple of years now. Has it been a battle to get the hiring managers brought into the recruitment function internally? What's that journey been like?
I wouldn't say it's been a battle. I think, Jat and I sing from the same hymn sheet on this stuff in terms of bringing everyone on the same journey. And I think one of the challenges, internal teams have changed so much in the last 10 or 15 years. It's gone from that almost quite traditional HR manager putting a job ad out and hoping they land the right person and then going out to agencies if they don't, to actually some of the teams out there now are so skilled, they've got so much depth in their ability to talk about sourcing and employer branding. But one of the challenges, I think, is when those teams become blockers, that everything to do with recruitment is done by a group of people that sit somewhere in a dark corner and engineering get on with their stuff and everybody else gets on with their stuff. And I think the one really important thing, and it's almost sort of summarizing what Jat said, is TA teams should be enablers of recruitment. They are not the ones that do everything. They're the ones that make sure the company is doing the right things. So it's about going to your exec team and saying, this is what I need from you. It's about going to your interviewers and saying, look, this is how we give the best candidate experience. This is how we stay consistent in the way we approach things. And it's about looking around the business and saying, how can you help the recruitment here? Let me guide you on that, rather than saying, I'll do everything myself, because I think then you start slowing down the process. You're not getting the right information. And it's about going to teams. If our CTO says to us, you need to go and hire 100 engineers in the next 3 months, starting tomorrow, that's fine, but you need to do certain things to allow us to do that. And that includes giving us information, giving us access to people's times, putting recruitment as the most important thing in people's calendars. So, we have wash-ups at the end of every interview process. That wash-up is more important than any other meeting. It doesn't matter who has booked a meeting in with you, you cancel that and turn up to the wash-up. And I think that's a really important part of the culture. It puts recruitment first beyond anything else. And it means that people are engaged in how they can commit time to it. And actually now in the last year or so, they've put it into people's 6 monthly reviews. What's been your contribution to the Skyscanner recruitment process? And that can be as an interviewer, it can be helping to rewrite a test, it can be meeting candidates, helping to sell the job at the end. But that's been a huge step change for us, because it gives people added motivation to, hey, how can I help, sort of thing. And that's really good.
Yeah, I love that. That's the first time I've heard of that being tied into 6-month reviews. There's some really interesting conversation coming on Friday about how D&I is being tied into a lot of people's reviews now, which I think is fascinating. But that's the first time I've heard recruitment being tied in, which is a really, really nice touch. We've got a couple of minutes left. We're going to round up, and Morgan, I'm going to start with you because you've already given a brilliant idea around this, around the measurement side. We can only improve what we can measure. So how are we thinking about measuring candidate experience and hiring manager experience? You've already given an amazing example around the NPS from a hiring manager perspective. How are you measuring the candidate experience throughout the process as well?
Well, we do now actually have generated a candidate experience NPS as well. Is that obviously doing our in process. There is an after process with people that we've onboarded. We also, one of the things that TA are challenged with is a point after somebody's come on board, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, re-engaging with the candidate they brought on board. And that's really just partly to get referrals, partly to talk about how they've settled into the business and to touch base. And we've actually had instances where somebody's perhaps come into the business and have not understood it or have been missold what they thought the role was, or they don't like the project they're on. And through that communication with the TA team reach out to the hiring manager and they put that person on a different project and they didn't leave. So it really is, and it's some of the data as well. Obviously, we're a data and analytics company, so we do we do look at obviously the data in terms of who we're engaging with and what our cost to hire is and time to hire and who falls out of the process, all those sort of things. So we're quite data driven, which I'm sure comes as no surprise.
And I love that TA checking with candidates that join slightly later, because it does happen, right? Candidates do get sold a dream, or through no fault of anyone's, own, but maybe there's miscommunication throughout. And actually closing that loop and making sure that you don't lose that person after you've invested so much time in getting them into the business is a really, really nice touch.
It's a nice touch. It's also a touch that came about because one of our KPIs in recruitment is if somebody leaves the business in under a year, that is something that's reflected on us. So we're actually held to that data as well. And I always argue, of course, well, we didn't mentor them, we didn't manage them, we didn't lead them, we didn't develop them, and they're like, nope. They left in under a year, that's recruitment.
Yeah, I do feel like a lot gets left with the recruitment team. I think that's been a theme of pretty much pretty much every panel this week, is that the recruitment team get held accountable for an awful lot. But maybe the framing should be enablers rather than being held accountable for everything. Jack, what about you? How are you measuring candidate experience, hiring manager experience, qualitative, quantitative? What are kind of your take on this?
Yeah, and so for how we're measuring this, I'll shift it away from how we measure like performance, because I think you're asking a different question. And so we do the sort of surveys. Morgan does this sort of automated surveys, and I guess we scour Glassdoor and we ask all candidates to fill out Glassdoor reviews on our hiring processes, especially the ones who didn't receive an offer or declined an offer. We ask them to publicly write why that was. So we do have a focus on that. Another thing is, it's a mindset around making sure that we record very consistently, the reasons why people pull out or give us feedback. I think the quantitative data is always easier to measure, right, Mark? And qualitative data requires a lot of manual time. But we've got a view now, and I've certainly rolled this out globally, where if a candidate is pulling out or gives us negative feedback, you have associated buckets, right? And you put that in your systems so you can measure why. And very consistently why. And I'm a big stickler about this because it's the only way you can really measure, right, if there's a trend. And it's okay if 1 or 2 candidates or 3 or 4 over a long period of time say they declined you guys because of total comp, or it might be because the stack was rubbish or whatever. But actually, if you measure it really consistently, then you can have a much more, a much more meaningful process at the end of the day with that particular candidate, right? Whether they decide to exit the process or whether we decide to exit them from the process, it's just easier. So yeah, I would say very data driven as well. And I think just to take it a step further, I take a lot of time to also include this in a lot of internal meetings, and often for our tech leadership team, I do a bi-weekly sync where I share loads of data. Everyone loves data at FC, and a big part of that show is around why we didn't net some people, a lot of data behind that. So I think this can be good for measuring candidates' feedback, but also you could spin it on its head to measure our own hiring team performance and, some good insights, right, for our hiring process for leadership teams. So got a few ways of spinning that, but that's what we do. There probably are a few other tools out there you could buy, but I feel like a lot of these tools won't get used unless it's really, really sort of emphasized internally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope we're all labeling our data correctly, unlike the briefings we have to listen to a lot at the moment. But Ed, we'll wrap up with you on measuring. What's kind of your style? What have you seen work to Sky's kind of previous life as well is kind of the most effective way to measure this stuff?
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and be quick, but we do the same. We do the surveys with the candidates and things like that. I really like the idea of the NPS scores, particularly on the recruitment team. I think I might have to speak to you about that afterwards, Morgan. My personal favourite, and quite similar to Jinder, like you can present data all day long and numbers tell some of the story, but I always try and add to that evidence of emails that have come through giving direct feedback, good or bad, notes that I've had, conversations with candidates, the sitting down for a coffee 2 weeks after somebody's joined and talking about why did you choose us, who were your other options, how did we compare, what was good out of their process, what was bad out of ours, is for me the most important thing. These are people that have it super fresh in their mind. They've just opted in for a reason, and you need to find out why and amplify that and find out anything that risked it. We had a candidate that joined at the beginning of the year who said it sounded too good to be true, so I nearly didn't join for that, and I realized I had to tone it down a little bit in terms of my brand advocacy of just shouting about Skyscanner. But it's really interesting to take all of that on board and to really go into some depth if you can. And it's not data, which is very trendy to get. It's just about data all the time, but actually just having conversations with people is still the best way, I think, to get that feedback.
Yeah, people still like a story, right? And you've got a relevant anecdote, it can add some meaning behind the numbers. Amazing. Panelists, thank you so much. Morgan, Jat, Ed, really appreciate you taking your time out your very busy schedules to do this. That was another awesome session, so thank you so much. For everybody that tuned in, thank you as well. Some great questions came in there. Like I said, we will be doing a write-up of this session. We will share the video afterwards as well, so please get involved in that. Tomorrow, onboarding and retention, an area of the funnel that just does not get the attention it deserves. Another great lineup of panelists. And there's one really interesting topic tomorrow, which is around designing boot camps to upskill senior engineers in niche technologies, which I'm very excited to listen to more about. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees, and hopefully we'll see you again tomorrow.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.